Welcome to One Africa Show, your trusted platform for global African voices, critical conversation, and unfiltered truth. I'm your host, Patrick Newman. We turn our attention this week to Kenya, where the streets of Nairobi and other major cities have erupted once again with protest 1 year after deadly tax demonstration that shook the nation. This time, the anger runs deeper. Dozens of people have been confirmed dead, 100 injured, and the government has responded with force and censorship, raising fresh questions about governance in human rights and the future of democracy in Kenya.
We're fighting for a better Kenya. We want the world to know ya kwamba youth, we are very peaceful. I can confirm that nimekuwa hapa tangu asubuhi and young people in Mombasa across the country are peaceful.
Mpaka sasa tunataka justice ya Albert Ojwang, tunataka justice kwa vijana wote. Nakumbuka Masai mwaka jana alikufa kwa kupigania nchi yetu. Tunataka amani. Kasongo must go. Kasongo one down. Tumechoka na ufisadi, tumechoka na mauaji.
To help us unpack this is political analyst and professor of public policy, international affairs, and constitutional law, Professor David Monda. All right, Professor, thank you for coming through. Many protesters are saying this is no longer about taxes. In your view, what broader issue are fueling public anger, especially among young Kenyans?
I think the issues are really being fueled by the Gen Z. That's what happened last year. But this year's anniversary has really fueled broader issues. In 2024, it was about the tax, the finance bill of 2024. But I think with the commemoration of the anniversary, the 1 year anniversary of the Gen Z protests, broader issues have started to come to light. I think very recently, as I'm sure you've been following the Kenya news, there's been a series of abductions by suspected government agents of bloggers. One was recently tortured and killed 2 weeks ago in police custody, and it's supposedly said it's from one by the Deputy Inspector General, and that case is in court. 6 suspects are in court right now. But more broadly, just a question of abuse of police power. Police brutality has become a big issue. Taxation is still an issue. And also, I think you'll see even in the current tax bill, the government was very careful not to raise new taxes or try to add the tax burden, because I think they were also very afraid of an explosion of that. So taxation, police abductions, broader questions of corruption within government, lack of transparency, accountability within government, and then of course broader macroeconomic issues like high youth unemployment and other areas around failure of what we call SHA, the social health program, which has not been working, and also the affordable housing, which a lot of people are upset about because they feel it's not a priority, but secondly that a lot of those funds are being mismanaged and are being channeled to special cronies with links within the government. So it's a whole range on not only public health questions, corruption, police brutality, and also wider issues of social discontent.
Speaking of police brutality, the police response, including live ammunition, tear gas, and media blackout, what does this say about Ruto's administration approach to dissent and civil liberty?
I think this is a very important context, not only just for Kenya, but even for the whole East and Central African region, whether we're thinking of Uganda and Tanzania in this context. I think from someone in the US looking at Kenya, I think it really shows how cunning regimes in Africa can be. Whereas on the surface, they'll be saying they're democratic, that they support human rights and liberal democratic ideals. their practice is completely different. So as you had mentioned, the illegal termination of live broadcasts by the Communication Authority, in Kenya, was done, and a lot of media houses were unplugged forcefully and illegally by the police. Secondly, we also saw, the President Ruto pledge on many occasions, even when he was here in Washington with the previous administration, that Kenya is a very democratic, liberal state that supports human rights and democratic ideals. But then we've seen extrajudicial killings continue. We've seen police officers go, and confront peaceful demonstrators with live bullets, masking their faces, and the courts have said that's illegal. If an officer is on the street, they need to be uniformed, and their badge number needs to be clearly showing, and their face cannot be covered so that protesters know who they're dealing with. And also the broader issues about this double speak from many regimes in Africa, and in particular in the context of Kenya, that there's a rollback on very basic human rights and democratic ideals, which are enshrined in Kenya's constitution. They are enshrined in the East African Charter on Human Rights and the African Charter on Human Rights, and also in the United Nations Declaration on Human Rights, and many international accords that Kenya and its East African neighbors, are signatory to, the Geneva Convention and the Rome Statute. So we tend to see a lot of this doublespeak, very cunning doublespeak, from regimes on the continent, and in this case in Kenya, where the rhetoric of support of human rights and democratic ideals is not reflected in the practice. What the governments actually do in terms of repression, criminalization of dissent, disregard for the rule of law, impunity. And one other element we've seen during these demonstrations, government actually employing vigilante groups, employing thugs and goons to create mayhem, to destroy property, so that it's blamed on the demonstrators, and the government can then justify using extrajudicial means to put down protests. So there's a whole different range of these issues that's domiciled within your question, right? But I think essentially it just shows you that within the sub-Saharan African context, regimes can be very cunning and manipulative of particularly Western governments that look at them, and foreign human rights organizations that are working on the continent, to say one thing, that they support constitution and liberal democratic ideals, whereas the reality is something completely different.
From a governance to legitimacy perspective, how damaging is this to Ruto's government to be accused of targeting protesters and silencing medias?
I think it's a big hit. An example I can give to you is Larry Madawo, who's a Kenyan journalist from CNN. Was accused by the Minister of Internal Security of putting down his country, of reporting negatively about his country. But his rejoinder was, his job is not to to report Africa favorably or to report Kenya favorably, but to report Kenya and Africa accurately. So you have to, as a journalist, you have to show in an unbiased and fair way exactly what's going on in front of you. You have to be a conduit for the broader public to understand what's going on. And I think this is a big hit for the Kenya government, specifically in terms of governance. Because for many years, Kenya has been seen as a leading light, not only in East Africa, but on the continent, in terms of democratic ideals, in terms of respect for human rights. Yes, there have been a lot of challenges over the years, but I think there's also been a lot of progress. In terms of the rule of law, you remember in 2017 when the courts overturned, an election, a first time in the history of Africa that the judiciary was actually asserting its authority in terms of telling the society what the law was, and that Uhuru Kenyatta had not conducted, a free and fair constitutional election. So to answer your question, yes, it's a big hit in terms of governance, but I think it really then also reflects a crisis of confidence, not only of the Kenyan public with the Ruto government, but also with the Ruto government of itself. And by that I mean, President Ruto promised so many things, unfortunately, that now he's realized he can't deliver during the election. We say in politics, campaign in poetry, but govern in prose, right? So politicians use all these flowery languages when you're, campaigning, but be careful that what you're promising people, you can also deliver. I think 2.5 years at the midpoint of his administration now, he's really realized that he has on most items that he promised, he's really failed. There's very few items you can look at, whether it's on domestic policy or foreign policy, that you can say he's really been successful. If you look, for example, in foreign policy, our Kenyan police are stuck in Haiti. The Kenyan taxpayer, Kenya is not a rich country. They're going to have to foot the bill for the Kenyan police in Haiti because the Trump administration's pulled out. Trump is refusing to fund that mission, and is not sure where the funding is going to come from. But be it as it may, even if those troops eventually funded the Kenya police in Haiti, we have all these contradictions. How police who are perpetuating brutality in Kenya can be sent to Haiti to protect lives in Haiti that they can't protect in Kenya. There seems to be some kind of mismatch. On foreign policy, there's critics to the Ruto administration who will argue, why are we sending Kenyan police to Haiti to deal with insecurity in Haiti when Kenya is actually under-policed? There's a lot of insecurity in Kenya and a lot of problems that need police help. So I think even in foreign policy, there's those questions. On domestic policy, the unemployment is going up. The borrowing has been a big factor. Ruto's borrowed a lot more than Uhuru Kenyatta. Within 2.5 years, he's borrowed more than Uhuru Kenyatta borrowed in his whole 10 years. Yet Ruto's pledge when he came to office was to cut down on unrestricted borrowing. All these foreign trips that President Ruto makes to foreign destinations, there seems to be a lack of an ideological and strategic foundation to Kenya's foreign policy. But then finally, on domestic policy, I think this is where we have this crisis of confidence, whereby the government just it seems to have run out of ideas in terms of how to fix public policy questions that are in the country, whether it's police brutality, whether it's unemployment, whether it's economic stagnation, whether it's about the runaway corruption. The president seems to be constantly in campaign mode for 2027, rather than dealing with the people's issues in 2025.
Speaking of policy, last year, tax bill was eventually withdrawn after protest. Do you think the current demonstration will lead to political concession on behalf of the government?
To be honest, I do not see concession on the part of the government if any of its recent behavior is anything to go by. By that I mean, already as we speak, 9 people lost their lives from the demonstrations yesterday. That doesn't include the number of police officers and civilians that were badly injured. If you look at the Kenya's fiscal deficit, the budget's been cut. Obviously, the government didn't want to do any more borrowing or to raise taxes because they were fearful of, another problem similar to what happened with Finance Bill 2024. So what they've done is to slash the government budget. And what that means is you'll have less money for provision of public goods, right? So healthcare will be affected because there'll be fewer medicines, less money to pay doctors and nurses and health facilities. When we think of maintenance of infrastructure, When we think of something that was really important from the Kibaki administration, free public education, because education is the greatest equalizer. So even the poorest of the poor, their children could go to school and get lunch and breakfast and lunch and come back home. And now it seems with these budget cuts, that's going to be slashed off. When the government tends to cut a lot of this provision of public goods, these education, healthcare, investments in infrastructure, you're really hurting the poorest of the poor, because many of these ministers in many of African governments, their children don't actually even go to school in Africa. Many of them are either in Europe or the US. So there's this huge disconnect, and I think with the type of repression we saw yesterday in the Gen Z demonstrations, there's very eerie images of the Kenya Parliament that was surrounded in wire mesh, protective wire mesh. It was almost seemed like a concentration camp. So it almost seemed like the people, it seemed like Dachau or Auschwitz. That same wire mesh that the Nazis used on the concentration camp was used to cordon off the people's house, which was the parliament. So it's almost like the people's representatives, the government fears its own people. And we had a heavy military presence, we had a heavy police presence on the street. And just the imagery was just so, so negative. And actually the government's now been sued in court, about these arbitrary restrictions to movement, because as early as 4 in the morning yesterday, Kenya time, most of the streets into the downtown were sealed off. So vehicles couldn't drive in. And the government's being sued around that. So to answer your question, I think, unfortunately, the government, as I said, doesn't have any ideas to fix these problems. It doesn't have the money to pay, because most of the money that Kenya is earning right now is going to service debt. And there's just very little money left to provide for public goods, for these basic needs of the people. When you factor in that most of this money is lost in corruption and in corrupt deals. So things are going to get worse before they get better, in my estimation. And particularly as the government becomes so much more obsessed with retaining power in 2027. I anticipate in 2026 and the months leading to the next June 2026 second anniversary of the Gen Zs, it will be about a year to the next election in 2026. And that's even going to be even more and more and more hot in terms of the politics, because the president really seems to be beleaguered right now. He's using state resources to campaign rather than to solve the people's problems, and I think that's a very dangerous thing.
As we conclude, speaking of economy, with the Kenya economy still in crisis, what option does Ruto have to address this fiscal reform and rising public dissatisfaction without further inflaming tension? Do you think?
I think there's a lot he can do, and governance. A lot of governance has to do with numbers and fiscal policy and central banks. But I think more importantly, governance has to do with legitimacy and whether the people trust the government. And I think that's one of the biggest problems for the Ruto administration right now. On day one, if I was, to advise the president, would be to say, you have to win back the people's trust. People have to believe that what you say is true. And one of the biggest challenges for President Ruto in the last 2.5 years has been he's been accused by a lot of critics as engaging in perpetual lies and half-truths, which the people can obviously see are not there, whether it's through his past statements on YouTube or past presidential pronouncements, things he's promised that he's not done, projects that were launched 3 years ago that are being relaunched again this year, just because the government's run out of ideas. So it's almost as very, very much stage managed. So I think legitimacy is one of the things. He needs to win back the public trust. And that might come through maybe reconstituting his cabinet again. I think slashing the number of ministers. I think the extravagance from a lot of his ministers, and their disregard for, for the public good and the public trust. His interior minister today was saying anybody approaching a police station demonstrating should be shot on sight. This is not the kind of language you want to have just after you've had a demonstration where 9 people have been killed and daily Kenyans are afraid about being, being abducted. So legitimacy will be a big one. But I think also in terms of then thinking about the numbers, maybe he needs to approach foreign donors and provide maybe a longer leeway to pay back some of his debt, and maybe convert some of that debt into equity or into long-term lower interest loans, or even have them written off. Because a lot of these economic questions can be negotiated government to government, right? But fundamentally, I think a basic issue will be about winning back the public trust, right? Getting that legitimacy back, the legitimacy of the Ruto administration's right to rule. Because right now, as I speak, the public mood in a majority of the country. Remember, there were about 27 counties, more than half of the country, 60% of the country was in demonstration mode. That really tells you a majority, more than 60% of the Kenyans are very discontent with this administration. So that legitimacy question will be one. He needs to maybe speak with the donors and try and realign his, his debt portfolios. But I think more importantly, this is my own personal observation. I tend to feel President Ruto, one of his strengths, but one of his weaknesses is he tends to be a micromanager. So he wants to know what every ministry is doing, what every cabinet secretary is doing, which can be good because you have a good idea of what's generally going on in your government. But the problem with that is you tend to take away, the freedom of your cabinet secretaries to work. And also it makes nonsense of this question of delegation. One president can't run 60 million people's problems. You need help. And I think one thing President Ruto should try and do is get a competent cabinet, get a bunch of technocrats who can reduce the volume of corruption that is in government, and then you have to work to bring the people back on board. Otherwise, things are only going to get worse.
Finally, looking at Kenya regional role and democratic reputation, what are the long-term implications on this ongoing unrest and for the country political stability and international image?
I think it's dangerous because we've tended to see an East African cooperation in a negative way, whereby we've been having Ugandans abducted in Kenya, sent back to Uganda. I'm sure you heard about the recent case of Kizza Besigye. We've had Tanzanians, efforts to abduct Tanzanians and send them back to Tanzania. We had, a Kenyan activist and a Ugandan activist sodomized in Tanzania, allegedly on their terms, brutalized and sent back. The current opposition leader, Chadema, Mr. Tundu Lissu is facing treason charges. Martha Karua, Kenyan lawyers wanted to represent him, including the former Chief Justice, and all that's been truncated. So I say that to say this: there seems to be a lot of regional cooperation between the three countries to repress dissent, very cooperatively, and I think that doesn't help, because whereas Kenyans have always tended to enjoy much more freedoms in terms of democratic spaces, it seems the Ruto administration is learning the bad manners from Kampala and Dodoma. And that's just not a healthy example for the region. Because if you look at a lot of Kenya's neighbors, it's either failed states military dictatorships or illiberal democratic regimes where there's a facade of democracy, but really it's either a one-party military state, as we have in Uganda, or a pseudo-democracy, which is really, a one-party state coated around liberal democratic structures that are not really real in the terms of the CCM. So it's unfortunate, but I think that the positive light is we have the Gen Zs, and the Gen Z's story is not just about young people. Remember, these revolutions, these changes that were happening since 1963 with the removal of a colonialist. It happened again in 1990 when many people died to bring back multi-partyism. It happened in 2010 when there was this big effort to change the constitution and allow for more freedoms. And I think the government's going to have a lot of problems if they try and restrict that democratic space, because the young people are educated, they're empowered, they're jobless, many with bachelor's, master's, some even PhD degrees, and they're very angry at the government. And if the government continues to play politics and manipulate ethnic competition and grievances, I think they might find themselves out of power. And, I think the Ruto administration need to be very careful, because in the run-up to 2027, should President Ruto stand, if he stood today for an election, it'd probably be trounced very easily by a united opposition. Whether that will happen in 2027 is a separate issue. But I think a majority of, a plurality of the electorate right now, right, if you put all the opposition together, would trounce Ruto, fairly easily, President Ruto fairly easily. So to answer your question, I think there's still a lot of hope for Kenya. Kenya's been through these very difficult transitions. And it'll be interesting to see whether we'll have the first one-term president in the history of Kenya that's removed through, a democratic process. Or will the president actually be able to save ship and sort out a lot of these festering problems, not only on domestic policy, but also in the foreign policy framework?
I guess he still got, 2 more years to figure out, right?
Yes, he still has 2 more years to figure it out. And as I said, Kenya's actually talking about half term rather than one term, half term, which is his current status. And I think one other thing to add here, which I think is also a hopeful point, when I end on a hopeful point here, is the repression we had in the 60s and 70s in Africa, in the 80s and 90s, you can't do that in 2025 because of social media, because of the internet, because of the world's become one global village. People in Nairobi see how people enjoy democratic freedoms in other free countries. People in Dar es Salaam or Dodoma or Kampala or Entebbe or Jinja, they see how, countries that have democratic systems function. And young people are tired of septuagenarians and octogenarians lording over them, so that the citizens of the continent become subjects and they're not citizens anymore, right? They are there they're vassals to serve the elites, very much like they served the colonialists, right? They are items to be discarded and used for the betterment of elites. And I think in 2025, with the social media, with the internet, with the awareness and the public education, and in Kenya's context, very importantly with these Gen Z demonstrations and the demonstrations from yesterday, was the civic engagement, right? That's a very important thing. When people realize the power they have through the ballot, through demonstration, through association, through petitioning their government, I think that's something that really needs to spread more broadly within East Africa and the rest of Africa. That citizens need to move from feeling that they are subjects and that they are benign actors, and to see that they have agency. If they get together, they can actually hold government to account. They don't need to be oppressed forever, right? They have agency. And one of the important things of doing this is exactly what you're doing on your channel here, citizen journalism, expanding awareness and knowledge about these issues and topics that are not necessarily carried on some of our legacy media stations, right? And also highlighting how changes in one country can really affect a region. Because it's something we've even been suffering here in the United States, a shrinking of this democratic space, an abuse of power by the executive, violation of immigrants' rights, police abuse, even here in New York City, is still a big problem, as we saw in Nairobi. The George Floyd situation of a few years ago, right? So these are, the rise of autocracy, and the repression of liberal democratic ideals is something that we have to be very clear and honest about. But I have to add that, liberal democracy doesn't deliver overnight. And that's what citizens need to know,
Gotta
right?
work for it.
Right, you have to work for it. And the other danger with liberal democracy is because there's so much freedom, and a lot of debate and arguing, things are slow, just like it happens in Congress in Washington, because everyone wants to be heard, right? You don't want to rush policy through like in a dictatorship, because you can end up hurting the country and hurting the interests of the people. So it's a double-edged sword, right? So you want to give people freedoms and rights, but people can't be arguing forever. And I think that's one of the things that Gen Zs really need to understand. They need to mobilize beyond hashtags and TikTok videos and YouTube videos. They really need to register to vote. They really need to raise public awareness beyond ethnicity, clan, and religion, right? To say, we really want politicians to deal with our issues. They cannot keep dividing us around ethnicity, around class, around region or gender, or any of these other cleavages. So I really think the information revolution is here, and for regimes that want to hold Africa back to the repression of the 60s, 70s, 80s, and 90s, I think their time is gone, because people are getting more and more aware, and the time for change is now.
On that note, I would like to thank you, Professor Monda, for your time. I appreciate you.
Thank you so much for having me.
To our viewers and listeners across the diaspora, the event unfolding in Kenya reminds us that the fight for democracy and accountability is far from over, not just in Kenya, but across the continent. Stay tuned, stay informed, and let your voice be heard. Don't forget to subscribe to the One Africa Show on YouTube. Follow us on major platform and join the conversation using hashtag One Africa Show. Until next time, stay strong, stay proud, and stay connected.